The day was like any other at the large corporate office, filled with employees hustling through their busy tasks and the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. Inside a neat, well-organized HR office, a scheduled interview was about to begin. The HR manager, a middle-aged man named Greg, was preparing for the arrival of the candidate. He glanced over the resume, confident that he had already made up his mind about this interview. The candidate, a black man in a wheelchair, had an impressive resume, but Greg quickly made assumptions about him based on his appearance. He didn't think much of it, believing the man in the wheelchair would have a hard time fitting into the fast-paced corporate culture of the company. When the man arrived, he rolled into the office, moving with ease and confidence. His name was Marcus, and despite being in a wheelchair, his posture and demeanor made it clear that he carried himself with a sense of purpose. His clothes were sharp, his voice steady, and his presence demanded respect. Greg glanced up from the desk, not giving much of a second thought to Marcus's entrance. The HR manager had dealt with many candidates, but he had never quite met someone like this before. "Good morning," Marcus said, his voice calm and polite. He shook Greg's hand firmly. "Good morning," Greg replied, glancing at his watch. He wasn't particularly interested in making small talk. He had a process to follow, and he was eager to get through this interview. The fact that Marcus was in a wheelchair seemed irrelevant in his mind. He was just another candidate he had to judge based on his qualifications, or so Greg thought. As Marcus took a seat across from him, Greg couldn't help but feel a bit uncomfortable. It wasn't because of Marcus's presence, but more because of the assumptions he had made. Greg had always believed that people in wheelchairs had limitations, and though he would never say it out loud, he didn't expect much from someone in Marcus's situation. It was a belief he hadn't questioned in years. The interview began. Greg asked the usual questions about Marcus's experience, his career goals, and his skills. But Marcus, unfazed by the obvious bias, answered each question confidently. He spoke about his journey, his accomplishments, and his passion for the work he did. With every response, it was clear that he was more than qualified. Yet Greg remained detached. His questions, though professional, lacked the enthusiasm he usually showed in interviews, as if he had already decided in his mind that Marcus might not be the best fit for the company. As the conversation progressed, Greg's impatience grew. He was eager to wrap up, but Marcus remained calm and collected. Greg, feeling a bit superior due to his position, made a comment about how hard it must be to be in a wheelchair and that some roles in the company might be difficult for him to perform. It was a remark that was dismissive, coming from a place of ignorance. He didn't think about how hurtful his words might be. Greg thought it was a harmless comment, but it was the first of many mistakes he would make that day. Marcus, however, did not flinch. He kept his gaze steady, not showing the slightest hint of discomfort. He wasn't going to let Greg's ignorance affect him. Instead, he remained focused, answering Greg's questions as if nothing was out of the ordinary. Little did Greg know, he was about to make a life-changing mistake, one that would completely alter his perception of Marcus and his assumptions about people in wheelchairs. In the back of his mind, Greg could already hear himself preparing for the next round of interviews. But today, things were about to take a surprising turn that would leave him reflecting on his actions for a long time. The interview continued, and Greg couldn't shake off the feeling that something was a little off. He wasn't quite sure what it was. Maybe it was just the unfamiliarity of the situation. Marcus was different from the usual candidates Greg dealt with. He was calm, articulate, and professional, but Greg kept finding himself looking at the wheelchair, making assumptions that Marcus's condition would somehow get in the way of his performance. The more Greg thought about it, the more he found himself questioning Marcus's ability to handle the responsibilities of the role. He couldn't help it. The biases had been ingrained in him for years, and they were hard to shake, no matter how much he tried to act professional. As Marcus spoke, Greg continued to evaluate him with a critical eye, but his focus wasn't entirely on what Marcus was saying. His mind wandered to things like how he'd need assistance to move around the office, or how he might require extra accommodations. Despite Marcus giving detailed answers about his qualifications and past experience, Greg's mind kept circling back to those assumptions. In his mind, Marcus's physical limitations were far more important than his actual abilities. Greg asked the next question, his tone a bit too casual. "So, with your condition, have you considered how you'd manage the more physically demanding tasks in the office?" It wasn't an innocent question. It was more of a dig, a way to subtly question Marcus's suitability for the job. Greg didn't see it that way, of course. He thought it was just a reasonable inquiry, something any HR manager would ask. But in reality, it was a reflection of his own lack of understanding. Marcus didn't flinch at the question. Instead, he smiled and answered in his usual calm manner. "I'm capable of handling anything required for the job. I've managed larger projects before with the same efficiency as anyone else. If I need help, there are ways to adjust things to ensure everything is handled properly." His response was direct, confident, and showed no hesitation. He didn't take offense. He simply addressed the question without allowing it to rattle him. Greg, however, wasn't satisfied. He was still trying to fit Marcus into a box, one that matched his preconceived ideas. As the conversation went on, Greg continued to ask questions, not so much about Marcus's skills or experience, but about how he would manage in the office setting, how he would interact with the rest of the team, and whether or not he could keep up with the pace. The more he asked, the more obvious it became that Greg was fixating on the wrong things. He was so caught up in his own limited view that he couldn't see the person sitting right in front of him. Marcus, still maintaining his composure, answered each question without reacting to the subtle judgment behind them. He wasn't here to prove anything to Greg. He knew his worth and his abilities, but even though he had an inner strength and confidence that allowed him to stay calm in the face of Greg's missteps, it was clear that Greg wasn't even trying to see past his own biases. The interview was dragging on, and Greg was starting to feel impatient. He thought he had enough information to make a decision, but he couldn't let go of his assumptions. His mind wandered, imagining that perhaps Marcus wouldn't be a good fit for the team after all. He continued to make small, dismissive comments, thinking they were harmless, not realizing how much they were revealing about his own lack of awareness. Marcus, however, remained silent, letting the questions slide off him. He had been through this before, and he knew how to handle it. But deep down, he couldn't help but wonder how long it would take for people like Greg to realize that they were wrong in their assumptions. This wasn't just about the interview. It was about breaking down the walls of prejudice that had been built up over time. What Greg didn't know was that Marcus had more power in this situation than he could possibly imagine, and Marcus's patience was about to pay off in a way that Greg never saw coming. As the interview progressed, Greg's subtle assumptions became more apparent. His questions grew more pointed, more probing, as if he were trying to find some weakness in Marcus's answers. Each time Marcus spoke, Greg felt more uncomfortable, though he wasn't fully aware of why. It wasn't just the wheelchair, it was something deeper, a discomfort with the way Marcus seemed unfazed by his line of questioning. Marcus's calmness was almost unnerving to Greg. Despite his biased approach, Greg still hadn't quite grasped the significance of the situation. After another round of generic questions about the role, Greg's tone shifted slightly. He asked, almost dismissively, "I suppose working in a corporate environment might be difficult for someone who's, well, limited in mobility." It was a statement, not a question. Greg wasn't even trying to hide his prejudice anymore. He had said it without thinking, believing he was simply being realistic. In his mind, someone in a wheelchair would undoubtedly struggle with the fast-paced, high-demand atmosphere of the office. He didn't even consider the possibility that someone like Marcus might have the experience, the intellect, or the capability to thrive in such an environment. Marcus didn't blink at the comment. He simply took a deep breath, his face showing no sign of anger or frustration. He had heard similar things before, in different settings, but it still stung every time. But instead of reacting with confrontation, He decided to handle it the way he always did, with grace. "I'm perfectly capable of handling the demands of the job," he replied, his voice steady. "If I need help, I find a way to ask for it, but that doesn't make me any less competent." Greg looked at him, trying to make sense of what he had just heard. He wasn't used to people challenging his assumptions so directly, especially not in such a calm and composed way. Greg could feel the tension building, though he still wasn't entirely aware of why he was starting to feel uncomfortable. He had been rude and dismissive, yet Marcus had handled it with such poise. It left Greg feeling disarmed. "Right," Greg muttered, clearly trying to move past the discomfort. He was still lost in his own thoughts, not fully registering what had just happened. He believed he had the upper hand in this conversation, that he could somehow control the outcome, but Marcus wasn't playing by those rules. Greg's next question, though, would make all the difference. He leaned forward slightly, still not taking Marcus seriously. "So, do you really think you'd be able to keep up with the team? I mean, the workload here can be pretty demanding. I just want to make sure you know what you're getting into." Marcus smiled slightly. He knew the question was coming, but he was prepared. "I've worked in environments far more challenging than this one," he replied. "I've managed projects, led teams, and solved problems that were far more complex than any you'll find here. If anything, this will be an opportunity for me to help the team, not the other way around." There was a pause. Greg stared at Marcus for a moment, unsure how to respond. The arrogance that had colored his initial judgments seemed to melt away. He wanted to challenge Marcus, to somehow prove that he wasn't cut out for the job. But the words didn't come. Marcus had responded not with anger or frustration, but with an undeniable confidence that left Greg feeling as though he were standing on unsteady ground. Greg, still processing, glanced at the clock. He was ready to wrap up, but something was holding him back. The interview had gone on longer than he expected, and now he realized that he had more than just a professional decision to make. He was starting to wonder if his judgment of Marcus had been wrong all along. And yet he hadn't fully understood the gravity of what was happening. Marcus had not just demonstrated his professionalism and qualifications, he had shown Greg that his assumptions and prejudices had no place in a workplace that valued talent and merit. Greg still had no idea who Marcus truly was, but in that moment, something about the man in front of him seemed different. He wasn't just a candidate. He was someone who might very well be teaching Greg a lesson, whether Greg realized it or not. But Marcus wasn't done yet. He hadn't revealed the full truth, not yet. He could have, but he was waiting for the right moment, the moment when Greg's assumptions would finally come crashing down. The interview had dragged on for what felt like an eternity to Greg, but Marcus remained as composed as ever. Greg's discomfort was starting to show, even if he didn't fully realize it yet. He had tried to keep his focus on the formalities of the interview, but his thoughts kept drifting back to his assumptions about Marcus. The unease he felt about this whole situation was growing, but Greg didn't know why. The man in front of him, who he had initially underestimated, seemed more than capable. As Greg prepared to ask another question, Marcus's calm voice broke through his thoughts. "If it's all right, I'd like to share something with you, something important." Greg blinked, caught off guard. He hadn't expected Marcus to take control of the conversation in this way. He was the one who had been steering the interview, but now Marcus was shifting the dynamics in a way Greg hadn't anticipated. Still, he nodded, curious, not thinking much of it. "I think it's important for you to know who I really am before we continue," Marcus said, his voice steady, but there was a hint of something deeper behind his words. Greg leaned forward, still unsure of where this was going. "What do you mean?" he asked, his tone now more serious, though still not quite understanding the significance of the moment. With a small, almost imperceptible smile, Marcus finally revealed the truth. "I'm not just here for an interview," he said, letting the words sink in slowly. "I am the CEO of this company." Greg froze. For a split second, he couldn't process what he had just heard. His mind raced, his stomach dropped. The man in front of him, The man he had been speaking to with such casual disregard, assuming he was just another applicant, was the CEO. The shock was evident in Greg's face. His mouth opened and closed as he struggled to find the right words, but nothing came out. Marcus sat back in his chair, watching Greg's reaction. He hadn't said anything dramatic, but the weight of his words hit Greg like a wave. Greg's mind began to spin as he tried to piece together the puzzle that had suddenly shifted in front of him. This was no ordinary job interview. This was a moment that was about to change everything. Are you serious?" Greg asked, his voice trembling slightly, unable to mask his disbelief. Marcus simply nodded. "I'm serious. I run the company. I've been the CEO for several years now." Greg sat in stunned silence, his face turning pale. He looked at Marcus again, now seeing him in an entirely different light. All of the assumptions he had made, the judgment, the condescension, the dismissive comments, were all based on nothing but ignorance. The man in front of him wasn't just someone with a disability to pity, nor was he someone to look down upon. Marcus had the power, the intelligence, and the experience to lead a major corporation, something Greg had clearly overlooked in his rush to judge him. Greg's mind was now scrambling. He had thought he was in control of the situation, but now everything was upside down. He realized just how deeply he had underestimated Marcus. The man he had spoken to so condescendingly, the man he had doubted, was the one who held all the cards. The HR manager was the one who was out of his depth now. Marcus remained calm, his eyes never leaving Greg's. He hadn't done anything to make Greg feel bad, yet the shame was evident on Greg's face. He knew the damage had been done. The words had already left his mouth, and there was no taking them back. The tension in the room was palpable. Greg cleared his throat, but he still couldn't find the words to apologize. Nothing seemed adequate enough. He had treated Marcus like an inferior, when in fact he was the one who was out of line. Marcus, noticing the shift in Greg's demeanor, gave him a moment to process. He wasn't going to gloat or rub it in. Instead, he simply waited, letting Greg come to terms with his own mistakes. It was clear that this moment was a turning point, not just for Greg, but for the whole company. But Marcus didn't need to say anything else for Greg to understand. The truth had already been laid bare, and Greg now had a lot to think about. Greg's mind was still racing. He sat frozen, staring at Marcus, trying to process what had just happened. His assumptions, his judgments, his entire approach to this interview, all of it had been wrong. And in that moment, Greg realized the magnitude of his mistake. The CEO of the company, the person he had thought so little of just minutes before, was sitting right in front of him. There was no escaping the truth now. He had just made a fool of himself, and the shame of it was beginning to weigh heavily on him. Marcus, on the other hand, sat quietly, calm and collected. His face showed no signs of malice or gloating. He wasn't here to make Greg feel small. He simply wanted to address the truth. He had seen Greg's discomfort throughout the interview, noticed the subtle judgments, the way Greg had assumed that his disability made him somehow less capable. But Marcus wasn't angry. He knew this wasn't a battle to fight with aggression or anger. Instead, he chose to sit back and let the weight of the moment speak for itself. Greg cleared his throat, his face reddening slightly. He had no idea what to say, and the more he tried to think of something to fix the situation, the more inadequate his words seemed. I didn't know," he finally muttered, still struggling to wrap his mind around the situation. Marcus nodded. "Most people don't," he said calmly, "but that doesn't make the assumptions any less harmful." His voice was not sharp, but there was a quiet firmness to it that left no room for argument. He wasn't angry, but he wasn't going to let Greg's behavior slide either. This was a teaching moment, whether Greg was ready for it or not. Greg swallowed, feeling the weight of his ignorance. He had treated Marcus like just another person to interview, a man with a disability who he assumed couldn't possibly be fit for the job. Now, looking back, he could see the flaws in his thinking, But it didn't change what had already happened. The damage was done, and no apology seemed big enough to undo it. "I'm sorry," Greg said, his voice soft and genuine. "I didn't mean to be disrespectful. I didn't know." The words felt hollow to him, as though they were too simple to make up for what he had said and done. But they were all he could offer in the moment. Marcus gave him a small, understanding smile. "It's okay," he said. "You didn't know, but now you do. That's the important thing." He wasn't going to hold a grudge. Life was too short for that, and Marcus had long learned that people could grow and change. Greg wasn't a bad person. He had just been blind to his own biases. Greg nodded, feeling a little bit of the tension lift. It was a small comfort, but it was something. "I'll do better," he said, almost to himself, but loud enough for Marcus to hear. "I'll make sure I learn from this." "Good," Marcus replied. "That's all anyone can ask for." There was no harshness in his tone, only quiet encouragement. He wasn't there to tear Greg down. He was there to help him grow, even if it was just a small step forward. For a long moment, there was silence between them. It wasn't an uncomfortable silence. It was more of a quiet reflection, a moment for both men to process what had just occurred. Greg sat there, trying to piece everything together, while Marcus simply allowed the room to breathe. There was no need for further words. Greg had understood the lesson, even if it was a hard one to swallow. Finally, Marcus spoke again, his voice calm and steady. "I'm not here to judge you, Greg. We all make mistakes. But I hope you'll carry this lesson with you. It's about seeing people for who they are, not for what you assume them to be." Greg nodded, grateful for Marcus's wisdom. He knew this was the turning point. He could either continue on in his old ways, blinded by prejudice and ignorance, or he could take this experience and use it to become a better person, a better professional. He could see now how easy it was to fall into the trap of assumptions, but he also saw how much it hurt, both the person on the receiving end and the one who had let the biases shape their view of others. The interview was over, but the lesson was far from finished. For Greg, it would be something he would carry with him for a long time. The memory of this day, the day he realized just how wrong he had been, would serve as a constant reminder to approach every situation with an open mind, to never judge someone based on appearances or assumptions. Greg sat back in his chair, still processing everything that had unfolded. The weight of the moment had shifted from a simple interview to something much more profound. He had assumed he was in control of the situation, but the reality was that Marcus had been in control all along, just by being himself. The truth of the matter was clear now. His biases and assumptions had clouded his judgment, and he had treated Marcus as if his wheelchair defined him, as if it dictated his potential. But now, with the truth out in the open, Greg had to face the uncomfortable reality of his actions. Marcus remained calm throughout the exchange, his demeanor unchanged. He hadn't reacted with anger or resentment, despite the disrespect Greg had shown earlier. Instead, he had taken the high road, choosing to educate rather than retaliate. Greg couldn't help but feel a deep sense of admiration for Marcus. In a world where many would have fought back or used their power to make a point, Marcus had chosen the more dignified path. It was a quiet lesson in humility, and Greg was beginning to realize that the man sitting across from him was much more than just a CEO. He was someone who had mastered the art of patience and understanding. "I truly appreciate you being so understanding," Greg finally said, his voice tinged with genuine regret. He had never been the type to make excuses, but he felt the need to acknowledge how wrong he had been. "I know my comments were inappropriate, and I can see now how they must have come across. I'm sorry for assuming things about you." Marcus nodded, his expression softening. "I understand, Greg," he replied. "We all carry biases, whether we realize it or not. The important thing is being willing to acknowledge them and learn from them. That's what allows us to grow." Greg felt a sense of relief wash over him, though it was mixed with a feeling of shame. He had been fortunate in this moment to have a second chance, to learn from his mistakes and understand the consequences of his actions. But he knew this wasn't just about a single apology. It was about changing his mindset, about ensuring that this lesson didn't just stay in this room. It was about carrying it forward into every interaction, every decision he made moving forward. Marcus leaned forward slightly, as if emphasizing his next point. "It's easy to judge someone based on what you see on the outside," he said, "but the real challenge is seeing the person for who they are beneath the surface. People are so much more than their appearances, their circumstances, or the assumptions others make about them. True strength is about resilience, integrity, and the ability to push through challenges, no matter how difficult they might seem." Greg nodded, absorbing the weight of Marcus's words. He could feel a shift happening within himself, an awakening of sorts. He had always prided himself on being open-minded, but now he saw just how much room there was for growth. It wasn't just about challenging his assumptions about Marcus. It was about challenging the way he saw the world, about learning to see people as individuals, not defined by labels or superficial traits. As the conversation continued, Greg found himself asking more thoughtful questions. He wanted to know more about Marcus, not just as the CEO, but as a person. He wanted to understand what had shaped him, how he had risen to such a powerful position in a world that often made assumptions about people like him. Marcus spoke freely, sharing stories from his journey, stories of struggle, perseverance, and triumph. He spoke not with bitterness, but with a quiet strength that only came from experience. Greg listened intently, absorbing each word. The more Marcus spoke, the more Greg realized just how much he had been missing. He had been so quick to judge, so quick to form conclusions based on limited information, that he had never taken the time to truly get to know someone. And now, sitting in front of Marcus, he felt a deep sense of gratitude. Grateful for the opportunity to learn, to grow, and to make things right. By the end of the conversation, Greg had a newfound respect for Marcus, not just as the CEO, but as a human being. He had seen past the wheelchair, past the external labels, and had discovered a man of incredible resilience and wisdom. As the interview wrapped up, Greg stood up to shake Marcus's hand once more. This time, the handshake was different. It wasn't just a formality. It was a gesture of respect, a recognition of the lessons learned, and the growth that had taken place in such a short amount of time. "Thank you, Marcus," Greg said, his voice sincere. "I don't think I'll ever forget this conversation." Marcus smiled, his eyes warm. "I'm glad," he replied. "Sometimes the most important lessons come from the most unexpected places." With that, the two men shared a quiet moment of understanding. The interview may have. As the interview came to an end, Greg couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted inside him. He had walked into that room with preconceived notions and biases, but now he was a different person. He had learned an important lesson, one that would stay with him for the rest of his life. Marcus had shown him a side of the world he had never fully understood, and now Greg realized how much he had been missing all along. But as much as Greg was reflecting on the conversation, he knew that the lesson didn't end there. It wasn't enough to just acknowledge his mistakes. He had to take action. He had to ensure that the changes he was making weren't just in his thoughts, but would also translate into his work and personal life. This was bigger than just a single encounter. This was about making sure that he never let his biases get in the way of truly seeing people for who they were. The next day, Greg couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. He had already started making plans to review the company's diversity and inclusion policies. As he walked through the office, he started to see things differently. He noticed the little things, the way certain people were overlooked, the subtle biases that still lingered in conversations, and how easy it was for assumptions to creep in. He realized that he wasn't the only one who needed to change. The entire company could benefit from a shift in perspective. Greg's first step was to call a meeting with his team. He knew that addressing these issues head-on was the only way to make a lasting change. As he stood in front of his colleagues, He spoke honestly about the lesson he had learned from Marcus. He shared the story of how he had treated Marcus with assumptions and bias, and how those assumptions had been shattered when he realized who Marcus truly was. It was a humbling moment for Greg, but he knew it was necessary. His colleagues listened intently as he explained how their company needed to be more mindful of the assumptions they made about others. Greg spoke about the importance of seeing people beyond their appearances, beyond their disabilities, beyond their labels. He talked about how everyone, regardless of their circumstances, had something valuable to offer, and it was their responsibility to create an environment where everyone could thrive. The conversation wasn't easy. It was uncomfortable at times, but Greg felt it was necessary. He encouraged his team to reflect on their own biases, to challenge their assumptions, and to do the work required to foster a truly inclusive workplace. Greg knew that change wouldn't happen overnight, but this was the first step in the right direction. He couldn't expect the world to change without first changing his own actions, and he knew it was up to him to lead by example. Over the next few weeks, the office atmosphere slowly began to shift. There was a newfound sense of awareness, and people started to engage in more open, honest conversations about bias and inclusivity. Greg made sure to incorporate diversity and inclusion training into the regular schedule, ensuring that everyone had the tools to recognize and challenge their biases. It wasn't a perfect process, but it was a start. Meanwhile, Marcus had been quietly observing the changes within the company. He hadn't been looking for any recognition or praise. His goal had always been to create an environment where people could succeed regardless of their background or appearance. But seeing Greg's willingness to learn and make changes to improve the workplace brought a sense of pride. Marcus knew that this wasn't just about correcting one person's mistakes. It was about creating a ripple effect that would reach far beyond that one interview. Months passed, and the company began to look and feel different. The atmosphere was more open, more accepting, and people began to work together with a deeper sense of respect and understanding. Greg had learned that leadership wasn't just about making decisions and managing people. It was about listening, reflecting, and being willing to learn from others. It was about recognizing that everyone had a story to tell and that everyone deserved to be seen for who they truly were. Looking back, Greg couldn't help but feel thankful for that moment in the interview room when Marcus had revealed the truth. If it hadn't been for Marcus's grace, patience, and wisdom, Greg might have never learned the importance of seeing beyond the surface. And for that, Greg would always be grateful. He now understood that true strength wasn't defined by appearances or preconceived notions. It was about embracing differences and fostering an environment where everyone could be their authentic selves. The company was better for it, and so was Greg. He knew that as long as he kept listening, learning, and growing, he could help create a space where everyone had the opportunity to suck. Several months had passed since that eye-opening day in the interview room, and the changes within the company were becoming more and more apparent. Greg had come a long way from the man who had once judged Marcus based on assumptions. The shifts in his own thinking had slowly transformed the workplace into a more inclusive, welcoming environment. What had started as a single conversation between Greg and Marcus had turned into a company-wide movement, a movement toward true understanding, equality, and respect for all individuals, regardless of their background. Greg had worked tirelessly to ensure that the changes would stick. Diversity and inclusion training became a regular part of the company's routine, and the feedback he received was overwhelmingly positive. Employees from all levels of the company began opening up about their own experiences, sharing their stories, and discussing ways they could create a more inclusive culture. What had once been a company where people kept their biases hidden had now become one where individuals felt empowered to express their true selves, knowing that their voices mattered. One afternoon, Greg received an unexpected call. It was Marcus, who had been busy with his own responsibilities, but had kept track of the changes happening within the company. "Greg," Marcus began, his voice calm but with an air of genuine interest, "I wanted to take a moment to say thank you. I've noticed a significant shift in the company. It's clear that you've been doing the work, and I'm proud of the steps you've taken. I see the difference, and I wanted to acknowledge it. Greg was taken aback by the call. He hadn't been expecting recognition. In fact, he wasn't sure he deserved it. "Thank you, Marcus," Greg said, his voice sincere. "I've learned so much from you, and I couldn't have done it without your guidance. The company has changed, but honestly, the real change started within me. I'm still working on myself, but I'm grateful for the opportunity to learn and grow." There was a brief pause on the other end before Marcus spoke again. "You've done more than just change the company, Greg. You've set an example for others to follow. It takes real courage to admit your mistakes and take action to fix them. Not everyone is willing to do that, but you did. You've made a lasting impact, not just on the workplace, but on the people who work there. That's something to be proud of." Greg felt a sense of pride swell within him as he listened to Marcus's words. He had known the journey wouldn't be easy, but he never imagined how rewarding it would feel to see the changes begin to take root. It wasn't just about improving the company. It was about improving himself and the way he viewed the world. And for the first time, in a long while, Greg felt like he was truly making a difference. In the weeks that followed, Greg continued to reflect on how far he had come. He thought back to that fateful interview, when he had been unaware of how deeply his own biases were influencing his behavior. It was hard to believe that he had once treated Marcus with such disregard, assuming his wheelchair defined him. Now, Greg could see how much Marcus had taught him, not just about disability or inclusion, but about the importance of taking the time to understand people, to listen to their stories, and to appreciate the unique qualities that made each person valuable. The company's transformation was becoming evident in more than just the conversations around diversity. The work environment was more collaborative, and employees felt more connected to one another. People from different backgrounds, different walks of life, and different perspectives were coming together to share ideas and work toward common goals. It wasn't just about fulfilling business objectives anymore. It was about creating an environment where everyone could thrive and feel respected. As Greg looked out at the office, he felt a deep sense of fulfillment. He had learned so much from Marcus, and the lessons he had learned were now being passed on to others. It was clear that the company was stronger than ever, not because of the numbers or the profits, but because of the shared sense of respect and belonging that now defined its culture. And as Greg continued to work alongside his colleagues, he knew that this was just the beginning. There was still more to be done, but the foundation had been set. Together, they would continue to build a workplace where everyone was valued for who they were, where their abilities, rather than their limitations, were the focus. The journey of growth and understanding had no endpoint, and that was something Greg had come to embrace fully. He would never forget the day Marcus had walked into that interview room. It had been a turning point for him, a moment that had changed everything. And now, as the company thrived, Greg knew that the lessons learned would continue to shape the future, one